Abigail Harper lifted her bleeding wrists against the iron and refused to let her knees fold. The town of Red Hollow had chained her to a post in the open square, hung the word thief above her bowed neck, and then done the cruelest thing of all: nothing. 400 souls. Not one stepped forward. But far past the edge of town, a gray horse was already moving through the dust, carrying a drifter no one in Red Hollow knew. And by sundown, every last one of them would learn exactly who he was. If you believe a woman should never have to stand alone against an entire town, take a moment to subscribe and follow Abigail's story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, what town are you watching from tonight? I want to see how far this story travels. The chain bit deeper every time she breathed. Abigail Harper had learned that within the first hour, and she did not intend to learn it again. So she held her chest, still kept her breath shallow, and stood the way her husband had once stood at the rail fence on a winter morning, like a person who had decided the cold was not going to be the thing that broke her. The sun came up over the false fronts of Red Hollow and found her exactly where they had left her at dawn, wrists raw, a wooden board on a cord around her neck. One word burned into the pine in a hand she recognized because she had balanced that man's books for 3 years. Thief. She did not look at the word. She looked at the faces. That was the only weapon she had left, and she used it. Every man who crossed the square that morning had to decide whether to meet her eyes or find something fascinating in the dirt. Most chose the dirt. Cyrus Bell, who ran the feed store and still owed her $4 for ledger work, walked the long way around. The widow Tate, who had wept in Abigail's kitchen the week her own husband passed, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and hurried her children past as if grief were catching. "Mornin', Mrs. Tate," Abigail said. The woman did not answer. She only walked faster. Abigail filed it away. She had a place in her mind for it, the same as she had a place in a ledger for every dollar that ever moved through her hands. Column after column. Names and amounts. Who owes what to whom. She had been keeping that book all night in the dark, and she was not finished. A man laughed somewhere near the saloon. The sound carried. "You reckon she'll cry yet? Mercer says leave her till noon. Says it teaches better that way." "Teaches what?" "Manners." Abigail turned her head toward the voices, slowed the chain dragging across the iron. Two of Silas Mercer's hands lounged in the shade of the porch hats, tipped back boots up on the rail like they owned the morning. The younger one looked away. The older one, Roy Dalton, did not. Roy Dalton came down off the porch and crossed to her, taking his time rolling a toothpick from one corner of his mouth to the other. "You look tired, Mrs. Harper," he said. "I've had better nights. Could end it right now. You know that." He hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Mr. Mercer's a fair man. Sign the deed, the chain comes off, you sleep in a real bed tonight. Maybe even keep the milk cow." He smiled around the toothpick. "He don't need the cow. He doesn't need the land either," Abigail said. "But here we are." "Here we are," Dalton agreed pleasantly. "Difference is, I get to walk home at the end of it." "You get to walk home," she said. Roy Dalton, born 2 counties over, owes the bank $81 on a horse that died last spring, signed his mark on a paper he never read because he can't read. "I keep the bank's books. I know what you walk home to." The toothpick stopped moving. For 1 second, just one something flickered behind the man's eyes that was not cruelty. Then it closed up again the way a door closes. "You always did talk too much," he said, and went back to the porch. She had not said it to wound him. She had said it because it was true, and because in a town that had agreed to pretend none of this was happening, the truth was the only thing she had left that they could not lock to a post. The sun climbed. Her shoulders began to shake from holding still, and she let them because trying to stop it took strength she needed for other things. It had started as these things do, with a death and a number. Thomas Harper had been a careful man. 40 acres of river-bottom land along the Pecos, the only good water for 6 miles in any direction, fenced and ditched and paid for, with 11 years of his back. When the fever took him the winter before last, he left Abigail 2 things: the deed and a debt of $63.40 at the Red Hollow Bank. $63.40. She could have paid it. That was the part the town never seemed to understand, the part she had stopped trying to explain. She had the money. She had walked into the bank in March with $63.40 counted into a flour sack, and Silas Mercer had looked at it across the counter and told her the debt had been reclassified. Reclassified, she'd repeated, compounding terms. He had smiled the way a man smiles when he is enjoying himself and trying not to show it. Late penalties, administrative adjustments. It's all in the agreement your husband signed, Mrs. Harper. I'm sure a woman of your particular talents can appreciate the arithmetic. The new figure was $412. By June, it was $600. By the time the sheriff nailed the notice to her door, the bank claimed she owed $1,100 on a $63 note, and the only asset that could possibly satisfy it was 40 acres of the best water in the territory. She had done what a careful woman does. She had asked to see the books. That was her mistake, not refusing to sign, not standing on her rights. Asking to see the books because the moment she said it, Silas Mercer understood that Abigail Harper was the one person in Red Hollow who could read his ledger and know precisely how he had built his fortune. Every farm he had taken, every widow he had moved off her land with a number she could not fight. Abigail had inked half those entries herself before she understood what they were, back when she thought double columns meant a man was just being thorough. She knew where the bodies were. They were in the bank, written in her own hand. So the punishment had to be public. It could not just be the land. It had to be the post and the word and the silence, a lesson written large enough that no one else in Red Hollow would ever ask to see the books again. She understood the design. She had always been good at seeing the design. What she had not counted on was how much it would hurt that nobody came. Toward mid-morning, Henry Slade came. The blacksmith was a big man, slow to move and slower to speak, and he crossed the square with his leather apron still on, and his hammer hand opening and closing at his side, like he didn't know what to do with it. He stopped a careful distance away, the way a man stops near a fire he respects. "Abigail," he said quietly. "Henry, I brought water." He held up a tin cup, then seemed to realize he had no good way to give it to her, with her hands chained behind the post. His ears went red. I'll just call Henry." Her voice was gentle. "Go home." "It ain't right." He said it low, almost to himself. "Whole town knows it ain't right. The whole town knowing isn't the same as the whole town doing." She held his eyes. "You've got a daughter, Henry. You've got a forge. Mercer holds the note on both. You bring me that water in front of his men, and you're standing where I'm standing by harvest. So drink it yourself. Walk home and don't carry the guilt of it. You hear me. Don't you dare carry it." This was decided by men a long way above your hammer. Henry Slade's jaw worked. A grown man near to tears in the open square and ashamed of it. "Drink the water, Henry." He drank it. Then he set the cup down in the dust, where she could see it, a small, useless, stubborn act of decency. And he walked back to his forge, and the only sound was the chain settling when she shifted her weight. She watched him go and thought, that one I'll remember on the other side of the ledger. The good side. The short side. The good side was always the short side. That was the thing nobody told you. Sheriff Mason Pruitt came out of his office at 11. He came because his office faced the square, and he had run out of ways to pretend it didn't. He was a tired man with a tin star he no longer believed in, and he stood on his own step for a long moment, looking at the woman chained to the post, like a man looking at a debt he could not pay. Then he came down and stood in front of her, and he could not quite get his eyes up past her chin. "This is a lawful detainment, Mrs. Harper," he said. The words came out flat, recited. "Pending settlement of debt. The board around your—" He stopped. "The board was not my doing. I know whose doing it was." "You're making it harder." "I'm making it true," Abigail said. "There's a difference. Mason and you used to know it. You arrested my husband once for being drunk in the street, and you walked him home instead of jailing him because you said the jail was no place for a man on the worst night of his life. You remember that Thomas always said you were the one honest thing in this town." The sheriff flinched as if she'd struck him. "Don't," he said. "He'd be ashamed of you." "Don't!" Louder now. A few heads turned. Pruitt lowered his voice and stepped closer, and for a moment he was almost pleading. "You think I want this? I got a wife. I got 40 years on me and no land, and a star that don't mean a damn thing because the man who hands out the pay also hands out the law. You want me to draw on Mercer's 11 hired guns over a deed they'd plant me by sundown, and the post'd still be standing and you'd still be chained to it. Tell me how that helps you." "It wouldn't help me at all," she said. "Then what?" "But you'd be able to look at your wife." Abigail's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "And right now you can't. Can you, Mason? You haven't looked your Ruth in the eye in 3 days." Mason Pruitt stared at her. Then he turned and walked back to his office and shut the door, and the click of the latch was the loudest thing that had happened in Red Hollow all morning. The town watched. The town always watched. That was its single great talent. She heard the horse before she saw it. Not the rhythm of it, the wrongness of it. Every horse that came into Red Hollow came in at a working pace, hurried the gait of men with somewhere to be, and someone watching to see they got there. This one came slow, unhurried. A walking pace, hooves landing soft, and even in the dust, the gait of a rider who had decided the town would wait for him rather than the other way around. Conversation on the saloon porch dropped off. Roy Dalton sat up. Abigail lifted her head. A gray horse came up the center of the street, and on it sat a man who did not look like much. That was the first thing she thought, and she would remember thinking it, because it was so completely wrong. He looked like nothing. Trail dust to the knees, a coat gone the color of old ash, a hat brim low over a face that hadn't shaved in days and hadn't smiled in longer. He rode past the bank without turning his head, past the sheriff's office, past the saloon where 11 of Mercer's men were now standing very still and pretending they weren't. He did not look at any of them. He stopped in front of the post. For a long moment, he just sat, the horse hands folded loose on the saddle horn, and read the board around her neck, the way a man reads a road sign in a country he doesn't know. His eyes moved across the single word. Then they moved down, to her wrists, to the iron, to the blood that had dried black and then opened red again where the chain had worn through. His jaw moved once. That was all. "Thief," he said. He had a low voice worn smooth like riverstone. He wasn't asking. He was reading it back to her. "That's what they tell me," Abigail said. "What did you steal?" "My own land, apparently." Something crossed his face, then too fast to name gone before it landed. He looked at her hands again. "How long they had you up there?" "Since dawn. It's near noon." "I'm aware of the time, mister." The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, the memory of where a smile used to live. "I expect you are," he said. From the porch, Roy Dalton called out, easy and loud, the voice of a man performing for an audience. "She's town business stranger. Best ride on. Water troughs at the south end. You can fill your canteen and be gone." The drifter didn't turn around. "This your post?" he asked Abigail. "It's Silas Mercer's post." "And the sign." His hand wrote it. My hand kept his books. She held his gaze. "He's afraid of the second part, not the first." The man on the gray horse went very still, and Abigail Harper, who had spent her whole life reading what men did not say, understood that this stranger had just heard the entire story in 19 words, and had filed it away exactly as she would have in a column under a name who owes what to whom. "Mister," she said low and fast before he could move. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. There's 11 of them. There's one of you. The sheriff won't help, and the town won't either, and you'll be in the ground by dark, and I'll still be standing here. So tip your hat, and water your horse, and ride on, and I won't think the less of you. I haven't thought the less of anybody today." Her voice caught just slightly. "I've run out of room for it." The drifter looked at her for a long moment. "That's a kind thing to say to a stranger," he said. It's a true thing. They're not always the same. No, ma'am, he agreed. They are not. And then, unhurried as the rest of him, he swung down off the gray horse. The whole square felt it. The pretending stopped. 400 people who had spent a morning being very busy looking at anything but the post suddenly had nowhere else to look. Roy Dalton came off the porch fast, and the other men came with him, fanning out the way men fan out when they outnumber what they're walking toward and want it known. I told you to ride on, Dalton said. You did, the drifter agreed. He dropped the gray's reins so they hung loose, ground-tied, an unconcerned man's gesture. I heard you fine. Then you got a hearing problem or a living problem. Pick one. I got a question. The drifter's voice never rose. Who locked these cuffs? That'd be the sheriff's office. Then the sheriff's got the key. Sheriff don't open 'em till Mr. Mercer says open 'em. Dalton spread his hands reasonable, the toothpick gone now. This here's a lawful debt matter. Comes down to paper. You understand paper, friend? 'Cause that's all this is. Paper says she owes. Paper says we hold her till she signs. You want to argue with the paper, the bank's right there. I don't argue with paper, the drifter said. Smart man. I burn it. The square went quiet enough to hear the flies. Dalton's hand drifted toward his hip. Not a draw. A reminder. Last chance, old man. Walk to your horse. And the drifter did the strangest thing. He walked to his horse. Abigail's heart, which had been holding itself very still all morning, dropped clean through her. Of course, she thought, and the disappointment was so sharp and so familiar it was almost a comfort. Of course he walks. They all walk. That's the lesson. That's the whole lesson. But the drifter did not mount up. He reached into his saddlebag slow and plain, so every man watching could see there was no gun in his hand, and he drew out a knife. Long, plain-handled. The kind a man uses for 100 small, honest things on a long trail. He walked back to the post. Don't, Dalton said, and his voice had changed. The performance was gone out of it. Mister, I am telling you. You keep telling me things. The drifter crouched at Abigail's wrists, close enough now that she could see the gray in his stubble. The deep weather creases at the corners of his eyes, a thin white scar that ran into his collar from somewhere it had no business coming from. He smelled of dust and horse and cold campfires. Hold still, ma'am, he said gentler than anything that had been said to her all day. These cuffs are old, the pins are soft. This won't take but a second, and I'd hate to nick you. They'll kill you, she whispered. Maybe. He worked the knife tip into the iron into the seam where the cheap pin met the cheaper hasp, and he leaned his weight on it with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use exactly as much of it as he needed. But I'll tell you something, ma'am, since you were kind enough to be honest with me. The pin gave a low metal groan. I have ridden through a great many towns, and in every single one of them there was a post like this with somebody chained to it and a crowd that found it real interesting to study their own boots. He looked up at her. His eyes were a pale, tired gray, the same color as his horse, the same color as the dust, and they were the most awake thing she had seen in months. I got tired, he said, of riding on. The pin sheared. The first cuff fell open and hit the dirt with a sound like a small bell, and Abigail Harper's right arm came free, and the blood rushed back into it in a wave of pins and fire, and she made no sound at all, because she had decided a long time ago, on the very first hour of the very long morning, that they would get no sound out of her, and she was not about to break her own record for a stranger's knife. He moved to the second cuff. You can't do this, Dalton said. His gun was half drawn now, and his hand was not steady. You hear me? You can't just... I can, though. The second pin groaned. That's the funny part. Everybody in this square spent all morning believing they couldn't. Couldn't bring the lady water. Couldn't unlock a cuff. Couldn't look her in the eye. Groan. Strain. The white scar at his collar stood out as the cords of his neck went tight. And here I am, a stranger with a camp knife, doing the thing 400 people swore up and down was impossible. He glanced sideways, and his pale eyes touched the crowd, moved across them name by name the way she had been doing all morning. Turns out it was real possible. Whole time. You all just needed somebody to go first. The second pin sheared, the second cuff fell, and Abigail Harper was free. She did not fall. She had promised herself she would not fall, and she had built that promise wall by wall through the longest morning of her life, and she would have rather died standing than let the town watch her crumple now. So she stayed up. She brought her two ruined arms slowly around in front of her, and she looked at her own wrists, the raw bands, the dried blood, the new. And then she looked at the man kneeling in front of her with a dust-colored coat and a camp knife, and a face like the underside of a long, hard road. "Thank you," she said. And then before he could even nod, "And damn you." The drifter went still. "You shouldn't have done it." Her voice was low and shaking now, and it had nothing to do with her arms. "You hear me, mister? You shouldn't have. They'll burn me out for this now. Whatever they were going to do, it just got worse, and you'll ride off into your tired of riding on and feel like a better man tonight. And I will be the one standing in the ashes of my own house tomorrow. You don't know this town. You don't know what he is. You cut one cuff, and you think you've changed something, but all you've done is made me the woman the stranger had to save, and now they'll never let me be anything else. I was winning. Do you understand that I was winning in the only way a woman like me can win, slow and quiet and on paper, and you just turned my whole fight into a story about you?" The square did not breathe. Roy Dalton's gun was all the way out now and pointed at the drifter's back, and the drifter did not so much as glance at it. He stayed crouched in front of Abigail Harper, looking up at her, and into his tired, pale eyes came something she had not expected and did not have a column for. Respect. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I don't reckon I do understand. Not all of it." He rose, slow joints protesting an older man's careful unfolding. He was taller than he'd looked on the horse. He stood between her and Dalton's gun without appearing to notice it was there. "But you're wrong about one thing." "Am I?" "I'm not gonna ride off tonight." Behind him, Dalton's voice cracked across the square. "Mister, you turn around real slow." The drifter turned around real slow. And whatever Roy Dalton saw in that dust-colored face when it finally came around to meet him, the full of it, the eyes, the stillness, the scar, it took the steel clean out of him. The gun dipped, just an inch. Just enough that everyone watching saw it dip. "I know you," Dalton said. It came out of him like something pulled. I've seen your face. On a..." He stopped. His tongue worked. "There was a paper. Years back. There was a paper with your..." "Lot of papers in the world," the drifter said. "What's your name?" The drifter considered the question the way a man considers whether to spend his last dollar. Then, from the wide doorway of the Red Hollow Bank, where he had been standing for who knew how long, watching the whole of it with his hands clasped behind his back like a man at a Sunday service, Silas Mercer spoke. "His name," Silas Mercer said, "is Jack Callahan." And the way he said it, and the way the 11 men around him went stone still at the sound of it, and the way Roy Dalton's gun came down the rest of the way on its own, like a thing too heavy to hold. Abigail Harper, standing free at last beside her broken chains, understood that the man who had cut her loose was not a drifter at all, and that the worst day of her life had just become something else entirely. The name landed in the square like a stone dropped down a dry well, and the silence after it was the silence of 400 people doing arithmetic they did not want to finish. Jack Callahan did not turn toward the bank. "You know my name?" he said. "That's nice. Doesn't change the cuffs." "It changes everything," Silas Mercer said, and came down off the bank step. He was not a big man, Mercer. That was the thing about him that always surprised people who'd only heard the stories. He was small and neat and soft in the middle, with clean hands and a watch chain and a voice that never had to climb because the whole town had learned to lean in for it. "Roy, put the gun up." "It's already down, Mr. Mercer." "Then put it away. You look like a fool waving it at a man who isn't worried about it." Mercer stopped a careful 10 feet off the way a man stops near a dog he isn't sure about. "Mr. Callahan, Or do I have that wrong? It's been some years since your name was worth printing. You've got it right. I thought you were dead. I get that a lot. No. Mercer tilted his head, studying him with a kind of pleasure the way he'd studied Abigail's flour sack of money across the counter. No, I mean, I had it on good authority. Cheyenne was at 81. The story I heard, you put 6 men in the ground over a card table and a 13-year-old girl, and you took a bullet doing it that should have killed you, and you walked out into the snow and nobody ever saw you again. They tell it different in different places, but it always ends the same. The legendary Jack Callahan rode off to die. He smiled. And here he is, cutting locks for widows in Red Hollow. Abigail said. Both men looked at her. My name's Abigail Harper, she said. Not widows, not her. You've used my husband's death to take my land. Silas, the least you can do is use my name while you do it. For one breath, Mercer's smile thinned. Then it came back smoother than before. Abigail, he said, and made it sound like an indulgence. Of course. Don't say it like that. Like what? Like you're doing me a kindness. Her ruined arms were trembling, and she did not try to hide it now. She let them shake and kept her chin up over the top of it. You've been doing me kindnesses for 2 years. A kind extension on the note, a kind reclassification, a kind little post in the kind morning sun. I am all out of room for your kindness, Silas. I'd rather you just hit me and be honest about it. Something flickered in Mercer's clean face, and it was not anger. It was worse. It was interest. You really did keep my books, he said softly. I'd half forgotten. All those neat columns. You've got a head for it. He glanced at Callahan, then back to her, and now he was talking to her alone. The gunfighter, forgotten the crowd, forgotten the whole engine of the morning, narrowed down to the 2 people in Red Hollow who could actually read a ledger. Tell me, Abigail, since we're being honest. When you inked the Pruitt foreclosure, the first one, the dry goods man, not the sheriff, did you ever stop and wonder why the second column never balanced to the first? Abigail said nothing. You did, Mercer said, delighted. You wondered, and you knew. You knew 3 years ago, and you kept right on inking because the work was good and the pay was steady, and a careful woman doesn't ask questions that lose her the only paying position in a town of 400. So don't stand there chained to my post telling me about honesty, Abigail Harper. You built half this with your own hand. I just had the stomach to use it. It was a cruel thing to say, and it was true, and the second part was what made it land. Abigail's chin came down a half-inch before she caught it. Jack Callahan saw the half-inch. That's enough, he said. I'm having a conversation. You're cutting a woman who's been chained to a post since dawn with words because you've run out of chain. Callahan's voice never rose. It just settled lower like weight coming down onto a floor to test if it'd hold. I've known men like you my whole life, Mercer. Every one of 'em thinks the cruelty is the cleverness. It ain't. The cleverness is the cruelty. You're just a small man who found a big lever. And you're a killer who found a conscience late, Mercer said. We're all somebody's disappointment. Roy. Sir. How many of the boys are here? All of 'em. 11. 11. Mercer turned back to Callahan, and the pleasure in his face had gone cool and businesslike. Now the flour sack look, the look of a man who has finished enjoying the arithmetic and is ready to collect. I want you to understand your situation, Mr. Callahan, because I don't believe a man of your particular history needs it dressed up. There are 11 men in this square who work for me. Every one of them has watched a hanging. Some have done the work themselves. You are one man with a camp knife and a reputation older than half of them have been alive. So, you have a choice, and it's a real one. I'm not toying with you. He let it hang. Get on your horse. Ride out. I'll even let you take a canteen. And Abigail goes back on the post until she signs, which she will today, because the post does what the post does. Or, Callahan said, or you die in my square and she watches, and then she signs, and the only thing your grand gesture will have purchased the woman is a worse memory. Mercer spread his soft hands. Either way, the deed comes to me by sundown. The only thing you get to decide is whether you're alive to be ashamed of yourself or dead and useless. Now, you strike me as a man who's spent some years figuring out which battles are worth dying in. Is this one? It was, Abigail had to admit, even in the middle of her own ruin, a very good speech. Silas Mercer had always been good with the speech. It was how he'd taken 9 farms without ever once raising his voice. Jack Callahan listened to all of it. He listened the way he'd worked the knife into the cuff patiently, like a man who had decided the speech would end when he was ready for it to end. And when Mercer was done, he was quiet a moment, and then he did something that made the whole square lean in. He laughed. It was a short, dry, unpracticed sound, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years, and it was so completely wrong for the moment that 2 of Mercer's men actually took a step back. "What's funny?" Mercer said. It was not a question, and there was the first thin crack of something in it. "You counted your men," Callahan said. 11. You said it twice. 11 men in this square." He shook his head slowly. "Mr. A man who's lived the life I've lived learns one thing better than any other, and it ain't shooting. It's counting. And the first thing I counted when I rode in past your saloon wasn't your 11 men." He lifted his chin just slightly toward the porch, toward the false fronts, toward the 400 faces that had spent a morning studying their own boots. It was them. Nobody moved. "You've got 11 guns," Callahan said. "And you've got 400 people who hate you and outnumber you near 40 to 1, and the only thing keeping those 2 numbers from changing places is that every single one of those 400 believes they're alone." He turned now slowly, taking in the crowd, and his voice carried without rising the way a low note carries further than a high one. "That's the Post. That's all the Post ever was. It was never about her. It was about you. Every one of you. He chained her up in the open so you'd all see what alone looks like. So you'd all go home and check your own debts and your own deeds and decide that the smart thing, the safe thing was to keep your head down and your mouth shut and your eyes on your boots." He let that sit. "How's it working out? You feel safe?" "Don't listen to him," Mercer said, and now his voice did climb just a half step and everyone heard it. "He's a drifter. He'll be gone by morning. I will still be here. I will still hold every note in this room. Do you understand me? I hold the Tate note. I hold the Slade Forge. I hold Cyrus Bell's store and the church mortgage and the water rights on the South Fork. You think this man can change that with a knife? He cannot. He will ride away, and I will remember every face that looked at him too long." And there it was. There was the thing Abigail had been waiting 2 years to hear Silas Mercer say out loud, in the open in front of 400 witnesses. "I will remember every face, the threat, the actual machine of it named in daylight." She felt it move through the crowd. Not as fear they'd had fear all morning. Fear was old news, but as recognition. The thing they'd all felt in the dark, and never said, had just been said by the man himself. And there is a particular kind of anger that only comes when a secret cruelty is finally spoken, plain. Henry Slade the blacksmith set down whatever he was holding. They heard it hit the dirt. Mercer's head turned toward the sound. "Henry." "Mr. Mercer." "Pick that up." There was a long, terrible pause. "No," Henry Slade said. It was one word. It was the same word Jack Callahan had said to Roy Dalton, and Roy Dalton had said it about a tin cup of water, and now it had crossed the square and come out of a blacksmith's mouth, and Silas Mercer's whole soft, clean face changed when he heard it because he had built his entire kingdom on the understanding that nobody in Red Hollow would ever say it. "You owe me $400 on that forge," Mercer said. "I do," Henry agreed. "And I've been paying it 2 years and the number ain't gone down once. I'm a blacksmith, Mr. Mercer. I know iron. I know when a thing's made not to open." He took a step forward out from under the porch shade. "Mrs. Harper kept your books. She just told us all plain that the number was made not to open. And I been too scared to do my own arithmetic, but I done it last night in my head lying awake. And you know what I figured? I figured I'll be paying that 400 till I'm dead. Same as my daddy paid the man before you. And then my Sarah'll pay it after me. That ain't a debt. That's a chain. You just put yours on the wrong person this morning, where we could all get a good look at it. Henry? Mercer started. I ain't finished. The big man's voice shook, but his feet didn't. I brought her water this morning, and I couldn't even give it to her, and I went back to my forge, and I've been ashamed every minute since. A stranger had to come do the thing I should have done. Well, he looked at Callahan, then at Abigail, then square at Mercer. I'm done being ashamed. You want the forge, take it. I'll smith out of a wagon before I'll put another widow on a post for you. And Cyrus Bell from the feed store. Cyrus Bell, who still owed Abigail $4 and had walked the long way around her all morning, Cyrus Bell said quietly, but loud enough. I'll smith you a wagon, Henry, free. It was a small joke. It was a terrible small joke, at a terrible moment. And it broke something. Because the crowd laughed. Not all of them. Not loud. But a ripple of it went through the square, the nervous, dangerous, releasing laugh of people who have just discovered all at once in public that they are not alone. And Silas Mercer, who understood crowds better than any man in the territory, heard that laugh and went white because he knew exactly what it meant. It meant the spell was breaking. It meant the 40-1 was waking up. Roy, Mercer said. Put her back on the post. Now, Roy, while they're still... Roy. Dalton looked at the post. He looked at the broken cuffs in the dirt. He looked at Jack Callahan standing easy between him and the woman, hands empty, not even near a gun. And somehow that was worse than if he'd been holding one. And Roy Dalton, who couldn't read, who owed $81 on a dead horse, who had signed his mark on a paper he'd never understood, because the woman now in front of him was the only person in town who'd ever told him the truth about what he'd signed. Roy Dalton said the third no of the morning. I don't think I will, Mr. Mercer. Mercer turned on him so fast his watch chain swung. What did you say? She told me. Dalton's voice was thick. Just this morning, right there at the post. She told me what I owe and why I'll never pay it off, and I knew she wasn't lying because she's the only one in 2 years told me a number that matched the one in my own gut. He holstered the gun. The whole way, the leather creak was loud. I ain't a good man, Mr. Mercer. I done things for you I'll answer for, but I ain't gonna chain her back up so a blacksmith and a feed store man can watch me do it. I just ain't. You'll have to find somebody else. You're all finished, Mercer hissed, and he was backing up now toward the bank, toward the door, and his hand had gone inside his coat. Every one of you. I'll have the marshals down from Santa Fe. I'll have the territorial court. You think you've got numbers? I've got paper. And paper is the law, and the law will hang. Funny you should mention the law, Jack Callahan said. Mercer stopped. And the marshals? Callahan went on conversational, almost gentle. And Santa Fe, and the territorial court. Because here's a thing you don't know about me, Mr. Mercer. On account of your good authority told you I died in the snow in Cheyenne in '81. He reached up slow, both hands visible the way he'd reached into the saddlebag, and pulled aside the dust-colored coat at his chest. I didn't die. I got found. By a man rode up out of the storm, and put me on his own horse, and got me to a doctor, and sat with me 3 weeks while the fever broke. And when I could stand, he offered me a job. Said a man who'd take 6 bullets over a 13-year-old girl he'd never met was exactly the kind of damn fool he needed. The coat fell open. On the worn leather of his vest, dull with trail dust, but unmistakable, was a star. Not a tin sheriff's star like the one Mason Pruitt no longer believed in. A different shape. A heavier metal. The kind of star that did not answer to a town or a county or a bank. The kind that came down out of the federal courts in Washington and rode wherever the territorial corruption ran deepest and answered to no local man at all. Deputy U.S. Marshal, Jack Callahan said. 5 years now. I don't cut locks for widows because I got tired of riding on Mr. Mercer. He let the coat fall closed over the star. I cut locks for widows because that's the job. And I have been riding toward Red Hollow for 3 months, following a paper trail of forged debts and reclassified notes and 9 stolen farms, all of it inked in a hand so neat and so careful that the federal court in Santa Fe sat up and took notice. He looked at Abigail then, and there was something in his pale, tired eyes that was almost an apology. A real neat hand. A woman's hand. They sent me to find the bookkeeper who wrote it all down. The blood went out of Abigail Harper's face. The crowd, which had been finding its courage, went silent again, and this time the silence had a different weight, and it was tilting slowly, terribly toward her. "You're here for me," she whispered. "I rode in," Callahan said, "looking for the person who inked 9 fraudulent foreclosures. Yes, ma'am. That's the truth, and you've earned the truth." He held her eyes. "And I found her chained to a post by the man she'd been inking them for, with her own hands torn open for refusing to sign the 10th. He turned deliberately, putting his back to her, and his face to the crowd, and to Mercer both. "Now, I have spent 15 years learning to count, and I have learned to count people too. There's the man who builds the machine, and there's the woman he traps inside it and forces to grease the gears. And any marshal worth his star, any judge worth his bench, knows the difference between the spider and the fly he's caught and made to spin for him." His voice dropped hard now, all the gentleness gone out of it for the first time all day. "Abigail Harper is going to Santa Fe, Mr. Mercer. You're right about that. She's going to stand in front of the territorial court." Mercer's face had begun very slightly to relax. "And she is going to open her mouth," Callahan said, "and tell them every single entry she ever inked, and whose hand it served, and which column never balanced to which and why. Because she is the one person alive who can read your whole filthy ledger out loud in a language a federal judge understands. And when she's done, you are not going to be a land baron, Mr. Mercer. You are going to be the most thoroughly documented thief in the New Mexico territory, by your own bookkeeper, in her own neat hand." The relaxation died on Mercer's face. "She'll hang beside me," Mercer said, but it came out high. "If she talks, she implicates herself, she's confessing to fraud, That's for the court to weigh, not you," Callahan said. "But I've put a fair few people in front of a fair few judges, and I'll tell you what I know. A judge hangs the man who built the machine. He doesn't hang the woman who got chained to a post for trying to climb out of it." He looked back at Abigail one more time. "Especially not when she's the one handed him the rope." For a long moment, nobody in Red Hollow moved at all. And then Abigail Harper began very quietly to laugh or to cry. No one could tell which, and perhaps it was both the two of them, so worn down to the same thread by the longest morning of her life, that they came out together. Because she understood all at once the full and terrible shape of it. She had been winning, she'd told him, slow and quiet, and on paper. She had been keeping her ledger of every face that passed her, her own private accounting of who owed what to whom. And the whole time, 2,000 miles of trail away, a federal court had been keeping the exact same ledger about her, and the stranger sent to collect on it had ridden into the square. Looked at the post, looked at her torn open hands, and decided in the space of 19 words that he had found a witness and not a criminal. "You knew," she said, "when you cut me loose. You already knew it was my hand in those books." "I suspected." "You cut me loose anyway." "Ma'am," Jack Callahan said, "I have arrested guilty people, and I have arrested innocent people, and I have learned to tell them apart by exactly one thing. It ain't what they did. Most everybody's done something. It's what they do when they think nobody's coming." He nodded at the broken cuffs in the dirt at her ruined wrists, at the wooden board still hanging from the cord around her neck. "You stood on that post since dawn, with the money to walk free in a flour sack at home, and you didn't sign. You let them tear your hands open before you'd put your name to one more lie." He almost smiled. "That ain't a thief, Mrs. Harper. That's the most honest woman in this whole county, and she's been hiding it in a ledger." And Silas Mercer, small, neat, soft-handed. Silas Mercer, who had taken 9 farms without ever raising his voice, chose that exact moment to raise his. "He's lying to you," Mercer shouted, wheeling on the crowd, and his composure was finally fully gone, his voice cracking up out of the smooth, low register he'd cultivated for 20 years into something thin and scrabbling and afraid. "There's no Marshall. That star's a tin show. He's a killer and a drifter, and he'll be gone by morning, and I will own every note in this room until the day you die. Do you hear me? I will. Silas." It was Sheriff Mason Pruitt. He had come out of his office at last. He had heard the laughing, and he had heard the no's, and he had heard the word Marshall and Mason Pruitt 40 years on him, and a star he no longer believed in walked down off his step and across the square that he had spent 2 years not looking at. And he stopped in front of Silas Mercer, and for the first time in 3 days, he was looking another man dead in the eye. "That star's federal," Pruitt said quietly. "I've seen one before. Long time ago, before I came here, before I got soft and cheap in yours. That's a real one, Silas. I'd stake my own on it." He reached up slow and unpinned the tin star from his own vest, the one Mercer had paid for. "Which I'm doing, right now." And he dropped it in the dirt next to Abigail's broken cuffs. "You're a dead man, Mason," Mercer breathed. "Maybe." The sheriff's mouth twitched something almost free in it. "But my Ruth'll be able to look at me again, and that's more'n I've had in 3 days, so I'll take the trade." He turned to Callahan. "Marshal, what do you need from me?" And Jack Callahan, Deputy U.S. Marshal, looked around the square at the blacksmith who'd said no at the killer, who'd holstered his gun at the sheriff, who'd dropped his tin star in the dirt at the 400 faces, no longer studying their boots, and at the woman standing free beside her broken chains with the most honest hands in the county torn open at the wrists. And Abigail Harper saw him understand that the spell was broken. The 40-to-1 had woken up, and the only person left in Red Hollow who didn't know it yet was the small, soft man backing toward the bank with his hand inside his coat. "I need you to send a rider to Santa Fe tonight," Callahan said. "Tell the Territorial Marshal Jack Callahan's found the Red Hollow books, and the bookkeeper, and she's willing to talk." Mercer's hand came out of his coat with a derringer in it. It was small. The gun the way the man was small. A neat, soft little thing built for close work and surprise, and he did not point it at Callahan or at the sheriff or at the crowd. He pointed it at Abigail Harper. "Then she doesn't talk," Silas Mercer said. And the whole square 400 and some souls who had spent a morning learning how it felt to finally stop looking away found that they could not look away now if their lives depended on it. As the only witness who could hang, Silas Mercer stood torn and unarmed beside her broken chains, and the man who'd built the machine took dead aim to close the last column in the only ledger that had ever frightened him. Nobody breathed. The little gun sat in Silas Mercer's soft hand like it had always belonged there, and Abigail Harper looked down the small black mouth of it and felt of all the wrong things calm. She had been afraid since dawn. She had been afraid of the post and the word and the silence and the long, slow theft of everything Thomas had built. But she found she was not afraid of the derringer. The derringer was honest. After 2 years of reclassified debts and administrative adjustments and kindnesses that bled her white, here at last was Silas Mercer doing the plain true thing, the thing she'd told him she'd rather he do, just hit her and be honest about it. "There it is," she said. "Be quiet. 2 years of paper, Silas, and it comes down to a gun anyway." Her voice did not shake. "I told you this morning. I'd rather you were honest, so thank you. This is the most honest you've ever been with me. I said be quiet." "Abigail." Jack Callahan's voice came low and even from her left. He had not moved. That was the thing she would think about later, that a man with his history, with that scar and those eyes, had not so much as shifted his weight. "Don't talk to the gun. Talk to me." "Why?" "Because the gun can't hear you, and I can." He took one slow step, not toward Mercer, toward her, putting himself an inch further into the line. "Mr. Mercer, you don't want to do this." "Don't tell me what I want." "All right." Callahan stopped. "Then let me tell you what'll happen, since you're a man who likes to know the arithmetic before he spends. You pull that trigger, You've got 1 shot in a 2-shot gun, and 400 witnesses, a sheriff who just dropped your star in the dirt, and a federal marshal standing 8 feet away. You kill her, you hang. Certain. No reclassifying that number. So the only question that matters is whether you take the rest of us with you, and you can't. You've got 1 bullet left after her, and there's near a dozen of us. You're a businessman, Silas. Run the figures. There's no version of this where you come out holding the land. There's a version where she's dead, Mercer said. And dead bookkeepers don't testify. No, Callahan agreed. But their books do. And that not the marshal's star, not the crowd, not the sheriff. That was the thing that made Silas Mercer's hand waver for the first time. What did you say? You heard me. Callahan's voice stayed gentle, almost kind. The voice of a man explaining a hard truth to someone too frightened to hear it the first time. You can kill the witness, but the territorial court doesn't need her breathing to read her hand. 9 foreclosures inked neat, every false column matched to a real one. That ledger's evidence whether she's in the room or in the ground. All killing her does is take away the one person who might have stood up and said some of it was done under threat. You shoot her, Silas, and you don't save yourself. You just murder the only voice that could have spoken a word of mercy at your own trial. Mercer's eyes flicked to Abigail, to Callahan, to the bank behind him, where the books sat in their iron safe. Where are they? He said. Where are what? The books, the ledgers. If they're evidence, Marshal, then you don't have them yet, do you? You rode in following a trail. You've got suspicion and a star and a clever speech. You don't have the books. A new thing was coming into his face now. The soft, clever thing reassembling itself behind the fear, and Abigail's stomach dropped because she knew that look. She had watched that look take 9 farms. They're in my safe, in my bank, behind a door only I have the key to, and here's the arithmetic you didn't run, Marshal. He smiled, and it was ghastly, and it was winning. I don't have to shoot her at all. I just have to walk backward through that door, lock it, and burn every page before your rider gets halfway to Santa Fe. No books, no case. A drifter's word against a banker's, and a dead drifter's word at that, because my 11 men are still standing right there, and your star doesn't stop a bullet. Boss is right, somebody said. It was one of the 11, a young one near the saloon who'd taken a step back when Callahan laughed, and now took a step forward, his hand drifting to his belt. He's right, there's still 11 of us, star or no star. 10, Roy Dalton said. The young man looked at him. There's 10 of you, Dalton said. I already quit. He'd drifted while everyone watched the gun a few feet to his left, closer to Abigail, closer to the line of fire, an unarmed man who'd holstered his own gun 10 minutes ago, putting his body where his courage was. And Pruitt's out. And I'll tell you something else, Tom Wheeler, since you're feeling brave. You want to fire on a federal marshal in front of 400 people for a man who's about to burn the only thing keeping him out of a noose. You'll hang too. We all will. Every man Drew pay off those stolen farms hangs. So you go ahead and count again, and count it slow, 'cause I've been doing the arithmetic Mrs. Harper taught me, and it don't come out the way Mr. Mercer says. The young man's hand stopped on his belt, and that was the crack. Abigail saw it run through the other 9 the way a crack runs through ice, not all at once, but you can hear it travel. Hang too. We all will. Every man Drew pay off those farms. Mercer had spent 20 years making sure no single person in Red Hollow ever felt anything but alone, and now his own hired guns were doing sums in their heads and arriving one by one at the same terrible total. Stand your ground, Mercer snapped at them. I pay you to stand your ground. You pay us in money you stole, another of them said quietly. Roy's right. I got a wife in Socorro. I'll double. You'll be in irons by sundown, Dalton said. You can't double nothing from a cell. Mercer's face was coming apart now, the smooth surface of it cracking into something small and cornered and old. But the Derringer stayed on Abigail. That was the thing. However the math went for his men, the small soft man understood that his whole kingdom now lived or died on the books in his safe, and the books in his safe lived or died on whether he could walk backward through that door. So he started walking backward. Nobody move, he said, the gun steady on Abigail, his feet feeling for the bank step behind him. Marshal, you take one step. She's dead and you've lost your mercy witness. You men, you don't have to fight. You just have to not help, and I'll remember which of you managed that much. I'm going to walk into my bank. I'm going to lock the door. And by the time anyone gets it open... Silas? The voice came from the bank doorway. Behind him. Mercer froze. In the open door of the Red Hollow Bank stood a thin gray man in a clerk's sleeve garters, holding a brass ring of keys. And Abigail knew him. Everyone knew him. Eldon Pace, who had kept the bank's front counter for 19 years, who had stamped every note and filed every deed, and never once in 19 years said a single word that anyone could remember. Eldon, Mercer said without turning, "Lock the safe, now. Burn the 83 and 84 ledgers. Do it now, and there's $100 in it." Eldon Pace looked at the keys in his hand. He looked at the back of Silas Mercer's neck. And then Eldon Pace, who had not said a memorable word in 19 years, said, "I already moved them." The derringer wavered. "What?" "3 nights ago." The clerk's voice was dry and quiet and absolutely steady. The voice of a man who has been waiting a very long time to say a thing and has rehearsed it in the dark. "When you told me they were going to put Mrs. Harper on the post. I've stamped your paper 19 years, Silas. I stamped the first Pruitt foreclosure, and I stamped the Vance place, and I stamped the Tate water rights. And I told myself every time it was just the stamp, just my job, the stamp don't decide, the stamp just records. And then you said you were going to chain a widow to a post in the square for a debt I knew you'd built out of nothing, because I'd watched her do the same honest arithmetic on it that you had, and I—" His voice cracked once and held. 19 years of telling myself it was just the stamp. I couldn't do it one more time. So I moved the 83 and 84 ledgers out of the safe 3 nights ago. They're not in this building, Silas. They haven't been in this building since Tuesday. The square had gone so silent that Abigail could hear the wooden board creak on its cord against her chest. "Where?" Mercer whispered. Eldon Pace turned his head slow and looked across the square, not at the marshal, not at the sheriff, not at the woman on the post. He looked at the blacksmith. "Henry," the clerk said, "is it still under your anvil?" And Henry Slade, the big slow blacksmith, who had said the second no of the morning, who had brought water he couldn't give, and carried the shame of it all day, opened his mouth and said in a voice thick with something that might have been disbelief at his own life, "It's still under my anvil, Eldon, right where you put it. I've been standing on it since Tuesday and didn't know what I was standing on." A sound went through the crowd. Not a laugh this time. Something deeper. The sound 400 people make when they understand all at once that the thing they were most afraid of was already beaten 3 days ago in the dark by the quietest man in town. Silas Mercer understood it too. She watched it reach him. She watched the arithmetic finish in that soft, clever face, the books gone beyond the safe, beyond the fire sitting under a blacksmith's anvil, where his own clerk had hidden them out of 19 years of swallowed shame. The men behind him doing sums about nooses, the sheriff's tin star in the dirt, the marshal 8 feet off, 400 faces that would never look at their boots for him again. She watched Silas Mercer arrive at the bottom of the only column that had ever mattered, and find it did not balance and would never balance, and that there was nothing left to reclassify. And she watched him decide that if he could not have the land, and could not have the books, and could not have his kingdom, he could at least have the one thing he'd wanted since she walked into his bank in March with $63 in a flour sack and the nerve to ask to see his ledger. He could have her quiet. "Then it doesn't matter," Silas Mercer said, and his voice was almost peaceful. "If I hang either way." And his soft finger tightened on the trigger of the little gun aimed at Abigail Harper's heart. 3 things happened so close together that afterward, no 2 people in Red Hollow told them in the same order. Roy Dalton, the unarmed man who had drifted left all morning, threw himself sideways into Abigail and took her off her feet. Jack Callahan, who had not moved a muscle in 10 minutes, who had stood so still that everyone had stopped watching. His hands drew and fired in a single motion so fast and so unhurried that it did not look like violence at all. It looked like a man pointing at something. And Silas Mercer's derringer went off. The two shots came so near together, they were almost one sound, and then the square was full of noise, screaming boots, the gray horse shying men shouting. And through it all, Abigail Harper lay in the dirt under Roy Dalton's weight, with her ears ringing and her torn wrists screaming, and the wooden board jammed up under her chin. And she could not tell in that first long roaring moment whether she had been shot. "Mrs. Harper!" Dalton's voice right in her ear, ragged. "Abigail, you hit! You hit!" "I don't..." She couldn't get air. "I don't know. Where's the blood? Where's..." "It's my wrists. It's just my wrists. Get off me. Roy, I can't breathe." He rolled off her, and she came up onto her elbows in the dust, and the first thing she saw was that she was not shot. Mercer's one bullet had gone wide high and wide into the false front of the feed store, where it would stay lodged for 30 years, as the thing children in Red Hollow were shown and told about. The derringer had fired into the sky because by the time it fired, Silas Mercer's hand was no longer aiming. Because the second thing she saw was Silas Mercer. He was sitting down. That was how it looked. He had sat down in the dirt in front of his own bank with his back against the step, and his soft, clean hands pressed to his shoulder, and the derringer lay 6 feet away, where it had spun from his grip, and there was a dark stain spreading under his fingers, and his face, his small, clever face, that had taken 9 farms without raising its voice, wore an expression of pure childlike astonishment. Jack Callahan had not killed him. The marshal stood with his gun still up, and a thread of smoke off the barrel, and he had put his bullet exactly where he'd meant to put it, in the meat of the shoulder of the hand that held the derringer. And Abigail understood that this too was a kind of arithmetic, that a man who had killed 6 over a card table in Cheyenne in '81 had spent 15 years learning that the harder thing, the thing that took more skill and more cost, was to put a man down without killing him. To leave him alive for the noose. To leave him alive for the books under the anvil and the testimony in Santa Fe, and the long public unmaking of everything he'd built. "You shot me," Mercer said, wondering to no one. "You shot me." "In the shoulder," Callahan said. He came forward, gun still up, and kicked the derringer further away across the dirt. "You'll keep. Doctor'll dig it out, and you'll have a stiff arm to remember it by. I'd have aimed kinder, but you were pulling on an unarmed woman, and my hand gets opinions about that." He looked down at the small bleeding man. "You're under arrest, Silas Mercer. Federal warrant fraud and land theft across 9 counts, and now attempted murder of a witness in front of 400 people, which I'll be honest with you is the part the judge is going to take personal." Mercer looked up at him, and for a moment the astonishment hardened back into the old cleverness, the reflex of a man who had never met a number he couldn't reclassify. "I'll get a lawyer from Santa Fe," he said. "I'll get the territorial. You do that. You don't understand who I..." "Silas." Abigail's voice cut across the square. She was on her feet. She had got up out of the dirt without anyone helping her, the way she had stayed up on the post all morning without anyone helping her. And she walked toward the man bleeding against the bank step, with her ruined hands held a little away from her body, and the wooden board still hanging from the cord around her neck, the word thief facing out for all 400 of them to read one last time. She stopped in front of him, and she reached up slow with her torn fingers, and she lifted the cord off over her own head, and she looked at the board for a moment at the word burned into the pine in his own hand. And then she crouched with great difficulty, and she set it down in the dirt in front of Silas Mercer, the word facing up, facing him. "You spent 2 years," she said quietly, "trying to make me believe I was alone. That was the whole machine, wasn't it? Not the debt, not even the land, the alone. You put me on that post so the whole town would see what alone looks like and decide they wanted no part of it." She straightened slowly. "And you were so good at it, Silas. I almost believed you. I stood on that post since dawn, and I watched every face walk past me, and I thought, this is true. This is just how it is. Nobody's coming." She looked around the square, then at Henry Slade, at Eldon Pace in his sleeve garters, at Roy Dalton, with dust all down his front, from throwing himself over her at Mason Pruitt, and his tin star in the dirt at Cyrus Bell, who owed her $4 at 400 faces that had finally stopped looking away. "And I was wrong," Abigail Harper said. "That's the part you got wrong, Silas. You can build a debt that never balances. You can forge a column and reclassify a note and chain a widow to a post. But you can't make 400 people stay alone forever. You just can't. The arithmetic doesn't hold." Her voice did not rise, and it did not break, and it carried to every corner of the square. "I'd have testified for free, but I'll testify for that. For the water Henry couldn't hand me, and the books Eldon hid under an anvil, and the gun Roy didn't fire. You're not going to Santa Fe for stealing my land, Silas. You're going for teaching this whole town to look away, and then living long enough to watch us all learn how to look back." Silas Mercer had no arithmetic for that. For the first time in 20 years, the small, clever, soft-handed man who had taken 9 farms without ever raising his voice opened his mouth and nothing came out, and he closed it again, and he looked down at the wooden board in the dirt with the word thief facing up at him, and something in his face that had been holding for 2 decades finally quietly came down. "Roy," Callahan said. "Marshal, you know where the sheriff keeps the irons?" Roy Dalton wiped the dust off his face with the back of his hand and looked for just a second like a man who could not quite believe the morning had brought him here. "I do," he said. "I helped lock half this town in 'em." He paused. "I reckon it's about time I learned the other end of the key. Then go fetch 'em." Callahan finally lowered his gun and slid it back into the worn holster under the dust-colored coat, and the easing of his shoulders told the whole square that the danger had passed. "And somebody get the doctor for Mr. Mercer. We want him healthy. We want him real healthy and real awake for everything that's coming." The square began slowly to move again. The held breath of 400 people, letting go all at once. Men crossing to help women, calling for the doctor, the gray horse settling. And in the middle of it, Abigail Harper stood very still, her wrists on fire and her legs finally beginning to shake now that they were allowed to, and she felt Jack Callahan come up beside her. "You all right, Mrs. Harper?" "No," she said honestly. "But I will be." She looked at her hands. "I think that's the first true thing I've been able to say since dawn. It's a good one to start with. Marshal." She turned to face him. The board was off her neck and the chains were broken, and the man who'd built the machine was bleeding in the dirt under guard, and there should have been some kind of relief in it, and there was, but underneath the relief was the thing he'd said before any of it, the thing that hadn't gone anywhere. "You said it before, that I built half of it with my own hand." Her chin came up, but it cost her. "When we get to Santa Fe, when I open those books and read them out loud, some of those entries are mine, Jack. Not under threat. Not at the start. At the start, I just thought I was doing good, neat work for a man who paid on time. The threats came later, when I understood and tried to stop. But the early ones..." She made herself say it. "The early ones I did clean and willing and proud of how neat they were. A judge is going to see that." Jack Callahan was quiet a moment. "He is," he said. "I won't lie to you. He'll see it. And you'll tell him the truth. All of it. The willing part, and the threatened part, and the standing on the post part." He met her eyes steady, the pale, tired gray of him gone gentle. "I've stood in front of a lot of judges, Abigail. The ones worth their bench, they're not really asking what you did. Everybody did something. They're asking what you did when you finally understood what it was, and you've got an answer for that one." He nodded toward the broken cuffs in the dirt, the dried blood, the wooden board. "You've got the best answer I've ever seen a person give. You let them tear your hands open before you'd sign one more lie. There's not a judge in the territory won't weigh that." She wanted to believe him. She found to her surprise that she was most of the way there. "Why'd you really do it?" she said. "Cut me loose. Before you knew about the men, before you played the star. You crouched down with a camp knife in front of 11 guns for a woman you'd been sent to arrest. That's not arithmetic, Jack. That's the opposite of arithmetic." And Jack Callahan looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away, out past the false fronts of Red Hollow toward the desert where he'd come from, and something moved across his weathered face that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. Cheyenne, he said. 81. Mercer had the story near right. 6 men, a card table, a girl. He was quiet. What he left out is she didn't make it. The girl. I took 6 bullets and put 6 men down, and it didn't matter because by the time it was done, she was already gone, and I'd been 1 minute too slow and I spent it shooting instead of cutting her loose. He turned back to Abigail and his eyes were wet, and he did not pretend they weren't. I have ridden past a lot of posts since then, ma'am, and every one of them I've thought about which I'd do if it came to it again, the shooting or the cutting. He almost smiled. This morning I rode in and saw your hands, and I didn't have to think about it at all. That's how I knew I wasn't tired of riding on. I was just waiting to find the one I could get to in time. Abigail Harper stood in the broken open square of Red Hollow with her torn hands and her freed wrists, and looked at the legendary gunslinger who had cut her loose, and understood at last that he had not saved her at all, that they had reached across 2,000 miles of trail and a card table in Cheyenne, and saved each other, the slow, honest woman, and the too slow gun, and that whatever waited in Santa Fe, neither one of them would be walking into it alone. They did not get to Santa Fe before it came for them. That was the thing nobody in Red Hollow had counted on. Least of all Jack Callahan, who counted everything. He had sent the rider that same afternoon a young man on the fastest horse in the livery, with a folded note in his shirt that said the Red Hollow books were found and the bookkeeper would talk. He had locked Silas Mercer in the sheriff's one cell with the doctor's dressing on his shoulder and Roy Dalton standing the first watch. He had set Henry Slade's anvil over the ledgers again because Eldon Pace said no safer place existed in the territory. And Eldon Pace had been right about everything else, so they believed him. And he had told Abigail to sleep that nothing more would happen tonight, that the worst of it was behind them. He was wrong, and he knew it by midnight. They're going to come for the books, Eldon Pace said. He said it quietly in the back of the bank where Abigail sat with her bandaged wrists wrapped in clean linen the doctor had finally tended. And Jack Callahan stood by the window, not looking at anything in particular, which she had learned was how he looked at everything. Who is? Abigail said. Mercer doesn't own Red Hollow alone. The clerk had his sleeve garters off now, and without them he looked smaller and older and more tired. A man who'd spent 19 years swallowing his own decency and had finally brought it up all at once. He's the face of it, but the money behind the bank, the men who bought the paper on those 9 farms, who lose every dollar if those ledgers reach a federal court, they're in Santa Fe and Las Vegas, and one of them's in Denver, and they did not get rich by letting a clerk and a marshal and a widow burn their investment in front of a judge. He looked at Callahan's back. You sent a rider, Marshal. So did I 3 nights ago, the day I moved the books. I sent word to a man I trust. And the word came back this afternoon while you were locking Mercer up. He paused. There's a man named Asa Quint. He works for the people who hold the paper. He's been in Las Vegas a week, which means he knew the books were in danger before you ever rode in. Callahan turned from the window. How far is Las Vegas? He said. It was not really a question. Hard riding a day and a half. Easy riding too. Eldon Pace folded his thin hands. He left yesterday morning, with men. And Abigail watched Jack Callahan do the arithmetic and watched it come out bad, and watched him not bother to hide that it had come out bad, which frightened her more than anything had since the post. So he'll be here by dawn, Callahan said. By dawn, the clerk agreed. She had been ready to be done. That was the cruelty of it. She had stood on the post since the dawn before and watched the machine break and set the word thief down in the dirt in front of the man who'd burned it, and she had let the doctor wrap her hands and let herself believe for about 4 hours that the standing was over. And now there was another dawn coming, and another set of men, and the books under the anvil were not the end of the fight, but the prize in the middle of it. How many? She said. My man counted 9 riding out of Las Vegas with Quint, Pace said. Could be more joined since. We've got the marshal, Abigail said, and Roy, and the sheriff if he means it, and 400 townspeople who learned how to say no for the first time in their lives 12 hours ago. Callahan said not unkindly. Against 9 professional men, plus however many Mercer's hired guns decide they'd rather throw in with the winning side after all. Saying no to a banker in daylight is a different animal than standing a line against killers in the dark, Abigail. I won't ask these people to do the second on the strength of the first. Most of them have got children. Then what do we do? And Jack Callahan looked at her and looked at Eldon Pace, and then he did the thing she would remember about him longer than the knife or the star or the bullet in Mercer's shoulder. He sat down at the bank clerk's desk, and he pulled a clean sheet of paper toward him, and he picked up the pen. "We do what Mercer did," he said. "We use the one weapon nobody can shoot." He dipped the pen. "Paper. Abigail, you and Eldon are going to teach me your whole filthy ledger between now and dawn. Every false column, every name, every dollar. And then we're going to make 4 copies of the part that matters in your 2 neat hands, and we're going to ride them out 4 different directions before the sun's up. Santa Fe, Las Vegas, under their own noses, Albuquerque, and 1 all the way to the territorial governor. Quint can burn the books under the anvil. He can't burn what's already galloping 4 ways into the dark." He looked up. "You can't kill a thing once it's copied. That's the only true magic there is. Mercer never understood that. He thought owning the original meant owning the truth. But truth's like a fire, Abigail. You don't put it out by taking the first log. You put it out by getting there before it spreads. And we are not going to let him get there before it spreads." Abigail Harper looked at the marshal and at the clerk and at the clean white paper, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt the particular fierce joy of a bookkeeper who has just been handed the right column. "Then light the lamp," she said. "And get more paper. My hands hurt, Eldon, so you'll write the Las Vegas copy from my reading, and the marshal will write the governor's, and I'll do Santa Fe myself, because that one has to be perfect." She was already pulling the chair in, already wincing as her bandaged fingers found the pen. "And somebody wake Roy. We're going to need writers, we trust, and God help me, I trust Roy Dalton more than half the deacons in this town." They worked through the night. It was not the work of legend. There were no gunshots in it, no wire traps, no bells in the dark. There was a lamp burning low, and 3 people bent over paper, and Abigail Harper's voice gone hoarse from reading out columns of figures, and her bandaged hands cramping around a pen, until Eldon Pace had to unwrap and rewrap them twice, and the slow filling of page after page in 2 neat hands and 1 rough one. But it was the truest work she had ever done, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, reading out the entry where Silas Mercer had taken the Vance family's 80 acres on a debt of $11, she understood that this, not the post, not the bullet, was the real fight, and that she had been training for it her whole life without knowing. "This one," she said near 4. Her voice had gone to gravel. "Eldon, this one's the rope." "Which?" "The Tate water rights. Look." She turned the original ledger toward the lamp with one bandaged finger. "He didn't just forge the debt. He backdated the recording. The deed says the bank held the water claim since '79, but the bank didn't exist in '79, Eldon. You opened the doors in '81. I've seen your own first ledger. He forged a claim against a date the bank couldn't have held it. That's not territorial fraud. That's a federal crime against the land office itself. That hangs him alone without my testimony, without anybody's. The date does it." She looked up, and despite the gravel and the cramping hands and the dawn coming, there was something close to triumph in her face. He was so busy making the debts impossible to pay that he made one of them impossible to be true. Copy that one twice. Copy that one 3 times. Callahan looked up from the governor's letter. "You found it," he said quietly. "After all this, you found the one entry that doesn't need you alive." "I found the one entry that means he can't win by killing me," Abigail said. "Those aren't the same thing, Marshal." She held his eyes across the lamplight. "I still mean to be alive. I still mean for you to be." And that a quiet thing said over a clerk's desk at 4 in the morning with no audience but a tired clerk pretending not to hear was the first time either of them had said anything like it out loud, and they both let it sit a moment, and then they went back to the paper because the dawn was coming, and there was no time to be anything but bookkeepers. The writers went out at 4:30. Roy Dalton took Santa Fe because it was the most important and the most dangerous, and because he asked for it. "I owe the most," he said, buckling the satchel of copies under his coat. "Let me carry the most." Henry Slade's son took Albuquerque on the blacksmith's own good horse. A Tate cousin took the governor's letter west. And Eldon Pace himself, to everyone's astonishment, the gray, quiet clerk in his shirt sleeves, took the fourth copy and wrote it straight toward Las Vegas, toward Asa Quint, toward the men he'd served paper to for 19 years. "You don't have to be the one," Abigail told him at the livery in the dark. "I stamped it," Eldon Pace said simply. 19 years. If anybody's going to ride into their teeth and tell them the books are already loose, it ought to be the man whose stamp made them legal. He gathered the reins. He was not a horseman, it showed. He sat the animal like a clerk sits a chair. "Besides, I've spent 19 years afraid of those men. I'd like to spend my last morning if it comes to that not being." He nodded to her. "Mrs. Harper, it was an honor to keep books across the counter from you, even crooked ones. You always caught my arithmetic when I was off by a cent." "You were never off by a cent, Eldon." "No," he agreed. "I wasn't." And he rode out into the dark, badly bravely west toward the men who held the paper. That left Red Hollow with the dawn coming, and the original ledgers under the anvil, and Asa Quint somewhere on the road, and only Jack Callahan and a resigned sheriff, and a town full of children to hold it. Quint came at first light. He came the way Callahan had come the morning before, slow, unhurried, a rider who'd decided the town would wait for him. But where Callahan had ridden in alone, and dust-colored, and looking like nothing, Asa Quint rode in, clean and easy, at the head of 9 mounted men. And he reined up in the center of the square, exactly where the post still stood, with its empty broken cuffs. And he looked at it, and he smiled, like a man who appreciated good work. "Heard there was some trouble here," he said to no one and everyone. Jack Callahan stepped out from the shadow of the bank. "Some," he said. Quint looked at him for a long moment, and Abigail, watching from the bank window with her heart in her throat, saw the same thing pass over Quint's face that had passed over Roy Dalton's the morning before recognition, and the swift, unpleasant arithmetic that came after it. "Jack Callahan," Quint said. "Now that's a name I'd hoped was just a story." He didn't reach for a gun. None of his 9 reached for a gun. That was the frightening thing about Asa Quint. Abigail understood at once. He was not a Roy Dalton, not hired. Fear, not a man who solved things with a draw. He was the next thing up the chain. He was the kind of man Mercer answered to. "I'm going to be honest with you, Marshal, because I think you're a man who values it. I'm not here for a fight. Fights are expensive and loud, and they bring exactly the attention my employers prefer to avoid. I'm here for 2 ledgers and a clerk who misplaced them. I understand the clerk's already left town in a hurry, which tells me he knows what's good for him. So that just leaves the books." He folded his hands on his saddle horn. "Hand me the 83 and 84 ledgers, Marshal, and my men, and I ride out, and Red Hollow never sees us again. And you can have Mercer and your widow, and your little morning of courage. I'll even leave you the post as a souvenir." "Can't do it," Callahan said. "Marshal, it's not that I won't, Quint. I can't. The books aren't here." Quint's smile did not move, but his eyes did. "The clerk took them." "No, the clerk took copies." Callahan let that land. "And so did 3 other riders 4 hours ago in 4 directions while your men were sleeping in Las Vegas. The originals are someplace you'll never find before noon. And it doesn't matter if you do, because the part of them that hangs Silas Mercer and every man who bought his paper is right now galloping toward Santa Fe and Albuquerque and the territorial governor's own desk in a bookkeeper's neat hand. You didn't come here to stop the books, Quint. You came here a day too late. The books already left." For the first time, Asa Quint was quiet. And in that quiet, Abigail Harper understood that Jack Callahan had just done to Quint exactly what Mercer had spent 2 years doing to her. He had made him believe he was alone, that the thing he'd come to protect was already lost, that there was no math left that came out in his favor. It was the same weapon. Callahan had just turned it around. "You're bluffing," Quint said. But he said it the way a man says it when he already knows he isn't being bluffed. "Am I?" Callahan took a step closer. Then ride to Las Vegas and check your employer's faith in you when the federal land office comes asking about a water claim backdated to a year their bank didn't exist. Ride to Denver and explain to the man up there how a clerk and a widow copied his ruin 4 ways in a single night while your 9 men slept. Or, and here Callahan's voice dropped into the low, gentle register that Abigail had come to understand was the most dangerous thing about him. Or you can do the smart thing, the thing a man who finds fights expensive and loud ought to do. You can turn those 9 horses around and ride back to your employers and tell them the truth. That Red Hollow's done, that the paper's loose, that the only move left that doesn't end in a federal noose is to be the first one through the courthouse door offering to testify against the others. He smiled, and it was not kind. Tell them whoever talks first lives longest. You worked that out yet, Quint. In a fraud this size, the last man standing is the only man hanging. Your employers are about to start a foot race to the prosecutor's door. You can be the man who told them to start running. Or you can be the man who let them sleep through it. Abigail watched Asa Quint sit his horse in the broken square of Red Hollow and run the arithmetic, and she watched it come out slowly, exactly the way Callahan had built it to come out, and she understood she was watching a thing she would never have believed possible. The morning before a fight won completely, with paper that had already left town by a man who had not so much as touched his gun. 9 farms, Quint said at last quietly, almost to himself. I told them 9 was too many. I told them you build a thing too big to fail, and you've built a thing too big to hide. He gathered his reins. He looked for a moment almost tired, almost like Callahan, 2 men on opposite ends of the same long road. You're a problem, Marshal. You know that a man like you with a star and a conscience and a head for arithmetic. There's no buying you, and there's no shooting you in a square full of witnesses, and there's no outrunning paper you've already sent. He shook his head. I find fights expensive, so I'll do the smart thing. But you understand, when I tell my employers the paper's loose, the first thing they'll do is go to the prosecutor, and the first name out of every one of their mouths to save their own necks. He looked toward the bank window, straight at Abigail, and tipped his hat to her, terrible and courteous. Will be the bookkeepers. They'll say she did it all. They'll say it was her hand. They'll bury her under 9 farms to climb out themselves, ma'am, and there'll be 6 of them saying it, and 1 of you. He turned the horse. You've won the morning. I'll grant you the morning. But you've bought that woman the longest trial in the territory's history, and you'd best pray her neat hand is enough to outweigh 6 rich men swearing she was the architect of the whole thing. And Asa Quint and his 9 men rode out of Red Hollow the way they'd come, slow and unhurried, leaving no gun smoke and no bodies. And a far worse thing behind them, a true thing, the truest and cruelest arithmetic of all, hanging in the morning air over the woman at the bank window. The square was silent. Then Jack Callahan turned and walked into the bank and stood in front of Abigail Harper, and she looked at him with the whole weight of what Quint had said settling onto her bandaged shoulders. 6 of them, she said, saying it was me. Yes. To save themselves. Yes. And he's right, isn't he? That's exactly what they'll do. She sat down slowly in the clerk's chair. I spent all night thinking I'd found the entry that means they can't win by killing me. The backdated water claim. I was so proud of it. A short, hard breath. But Quint just showed me the other side of the column. They don't need to kill me, Jack. They just need to point at me. 6 rich men with Santa Fe lawyers, all pointing at the one woman who actually held the pen. The backdated date proves the fraud happened. It doesn't prove I didn't do it on my own. My neat hands all over it. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the post, she looked truly afraid, not of dying, but of the slow legal unmaking Quint had promised. I made it too well. That's the joke. I kept those books so neat that the neatness itself is the evidence against me. Mercer's the spider, but the web's in my handwriting. Jack Callahan was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat, not for the star this time, and drew out a thin packet of folded papers, soft and worn at the creases, like they'd been carried a long way, and read many times, and he set them on the desk in front of her. I wasn't going to show you these till Santa Fe, he said. Didn't want to use 'em unless I had to. But Quint's right about the foot race, and you ought to know you're not running it empty-handed. He unfolded the top sheet. 3 months I've been on this trail, Abigail. You think I rode into Red Hollow knowing nothing but a bookkeeper's neat hand. I rode in knowing everything but the bookkeeper's name. And the thing I knew best, he turned the page toward her, is this. Letters. 11 of them. From a bank clerk in Red Hollow to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe, sent in secret over the last 14 months, each one describing a forged entry before it was filed. Each one begging the law to come. Each one signed with a single initial because the man was terrified for his life. He let her read the first line. E.P. Abigail, Eldon Pace. He's been writing the law for over a year, and in every single letter he names the entries Mercer forced, and he names which entries you tried to refuse, and he names the day Mercer first threatened you to keep you inking. He folded his hands. There's a clerk riding into Asa Quint's teeth right now with the truth in his satchel, and 14 months of letters in a federal file already proving he tried to stop it, and proving in his own terrified secret hand that the bookkeeper's neatness was a woman trying to keep an honest record inside a crooked house, hoping someone someday would be able to read it and tell the spider from the fly. Abigail Harper looked down at the 11 worn letters at the careful, frightened hand of the quiet man who'd hidden the books under an anvil and ridden out badly and bravely into the West an hour before. And she understood that she had never been alone in those books at all. That across the counter for 14 months, the only other person in Red Hollow who could read the true shape of the fraud had been writing it all down in secret and sending it to the one place that might someday save them both. He never said a word, she whispered. He said 11 words, Callahan said. Just not to you. He couldn't risk it. If Mercer had ever found one letter, Eldon Pace would have gone on a post of his own. He gathered the letters gently back into their packet. 6 rich men are going to point at you, Abigail. Quint's right about that. But they're going to point at a woman with 11 letters in a federal file, written by the only eyewitness who watched her try to refuse, and a backdated water claim she found herself and a town full of people who watched her bleed on a post rather than sign one more lie. He slid the packet back into his coat over the star over the scar. Let them run their foot race. We'll be standing at the finish line with the only thing that beats 6 rich men and a wall of lawyers. He almost smiled. The truth written down in more than one hand carried more than one direction by people brave enough to ride it into the dark. That's the whole game, Abigail. That's all the law ever was underneath. Not the star, not the gun. Just the truth copied enough times that no one man can burn it. And outside, far down the eastern road, a single rider appeared against the rising sun, coming hard, coming fast, coming back. And Abigail Harper rose from the clerk's chair, with her bandaged hands pressed flat to the desk. Not yet able to tell in that first, long, breathless moment whether it was one of their own riders returning with the law at his back or the first of Quint's employers arriving to start the foot race early. The rider was Roy Dalton, and he was not supposed to be back. That was Abigail's first thought as the horse came pounding up the eastern road. Roy had ridden out at 4:30 for Santa Fe, the longest road, the most dangerous, and a man bound for Santa Fe did not turn up at the edge of Red Hollow 4 hours later coming from the wrong direction. Something had gone wrong. Something had turned him back, and her hands went cold on the clerk's desk as she watched him come. Jack? Her voice cracked on it. That's Roy. He's coming from the east, Santa Fe south. Callahan was already moving for the door. Roy Dalton hauled the lathered horse to a sliding stop in the square and half fell out of the saddle, and he was talking before his boots hit the dirt, breathless, his face gray with hard riding and something worse. Marshal, I didn't get to Santa Fe. Roy, slow down. I couldn't get to Santa Fe. There's men on the South Road, 3 of them. Quint's men. They peeled off in the night and set up at the river crossing, waiting on a rider they near had me. He got his breath. I doubled back east and cut for the Tate place and sent the Tate boy on through the hills on a fresh horse. He knows the country, he's passed him by now. The Santa Fe copy's still moving, but Marshal, that ain't why I rode back. He grabbed Callahan's arm. "On the way through the hills, I crossed the real federal road, and there's a column on it. Coming this way. 6-8 riders in a wagon, and a man at the front with a star bigger than yours." The square went still. "What man?" Callahan said. "I didn't stop to ask his name. I rode here fast as I could to warn you in case it was—" Roy stopped, looked at the marshal's face. "You know who it is. I sent a rider yesterday afternoon," Callahan said slowly. "Before any of the rest of it. Before the books, before Quint. I sent word to Santa Fe the minute I had Mercer in irons." He turned and looked east where a low haze of dust was rising over the road, now the kind a column makes. 18 hours. Hard riding from Santa Fe, that's about right. Roy, that's not Quint's people. That's the territorial marshal. That's the law coming to Red Hollow because I asked it to." And Abigail Harper, standing in the bank doorway with her bandaged hands, felt something she had no name for, and no preparation for the thing she had stopped believing in somewhere around the second hour on the post. The thing arriving on horses down a public road in daylight. Help. Actual help. Coming because a man had asked for it, and the asking had worked. "They came," she said. "Jack, they actually came. I told you they would. People say a lot of things." Her voice was unsteady. "You said it the way everybody says it. They'll come, it'll be all right, the law's coming. I stopped believing that the morning they chained me up and not one of 400 people moved." She watched the dust rise. "I didn't believe you. I want you to know that. All night writing those copies, I did it because I thought paper galloping 4 directions was the only thing that could save us, because I didn't believe anybody was actually coming. I trusted the paper. I didn't trust the law." "I know," Callahan said quietly. "I could tell." "And the law's coming anyway." "The law's coming anyway." The column came in slow and deliberate, the way official things come, and at its head rode a broad, gray-mustached man with a marshal's star, and the unhurried certainty of a man who had spent 30 years arriving in towns exactly like Red Hollow and finding them exactly as bad as reported. He drew up in the square, took in the post with its empty, broken cuffs, took in the lathered horse and the gray-faced Dalton and the dust-colored deputy standing in front of the bank, and his weathered face did something complicated. "Jack Callahan," he said. "You sent me a note, said you'd found the Red Hollow books and a bookkeeper willing to talk. You did not mention you'd shot the banker, deputized a reformed enforcer, scattered evidence to the 4 winds, and stared down Asa Quint's crew with paper." He swung down off his horse. "I had to hear that part from a half-dead clerk we picked up on the Las Vegas road around midnight." Abigail's heart stopped. "Eldon," she said. "You found Eldon Pace." The gray-mustached marshal looked at her, and his face gentled. "You'd be the bookkeeper, then." "Is he alive?" "Ma'am, he's in that wagon, and he's got 2 cracked ribs and a knot on his head where Quint's men introduced him to the ground when he wouldn't tell them where the originals were." Abigail made a sound and started forward, but the marshal raised a hand, gentle. "And he's also got a federal file's worth of letters. He's been writing my office for 14 months, which I have read every word of, and which is the only reason this column rode 18 hours instead of 18 days. He's alive, Mrs. Harper. He's more than alive. He rode into 9 men with the truth in his satchel, and he gave it to us instead of to them, and then he led us straight here." The marshal almost smiled. "Stubbornest clerk I ever met. Wouldn't lie down in the wagon. Said he had to see Red Hollow's morning with his own eyes after waiting 14 months for it." And then the back of the wagon stirred, and a thin gray man in a borrowed coat, his head bandaged and his ribs strapped, raised himself up on one elbow and looked out at the square at the broken post at the bank. He'd stamped paper in for 19 years at the woman he'd kept books across the counter from, and Eldon Pace said in a voice gone reedy with pain, but absolutely steady, "Mrs. Harper, I caught your arithmetic at last. Off by 19 years. He let his head fall back, but I caught it. Abigail Harper crossed the square and put her bandaged hand on the wagon rail and could not say a single word. And Eldon Pace put his thin hand over hers, and the 2 bookkeepers of Red Hollow held on to each other in silence, because everything either of them had ever needed to say to the other had already been said in columns and entries and 11 secret letters, and there was nothing left to add but the holding. The unmaking of Silas Mercer's kingdom did not take long after that. It never does, once the spell is broken. That was the thing Abigail came to understand over the days that followed, that a thing built on everyone believing they were alone collapses the instant they discover they are not. And it collapses faster than anyone expects, because the only thing holding it up was the silence, and the silence was already gone. The territorial marshal took possession of the originals from beneath Henry Slade's anvil with 3 witnesses and a written record, and he laughed out loud when he saw where they'd been hidden, and he told Henry Slade that in 30 years of law, he'd never seen a safer vault. The backdated Tate water claim the entry Abigail had found at 4 in the morning, the one that hanged Mercer without needing anyone alive, went into the federal file beside Eldon Pace's 11 letters, and the gray-mustached marshal read it twice and said the words Abigail had been waiting 2 years to hear a lawman say. "This isn't a town matter," he said. "This is a crime against the United States Land Office. This goes to a federal judge, not a territorial one. And a federal judge, Mrs. Harper, doesn't care 2 cents which rich men in Denver lose their investment. He cares about the date, and the date doesn't lie." Silas Mercer was taken out of the sheriff's 1 cell and put in the wagon in irons, his arm still stiff from Callahan's bullet, and he did not look small anymore, so much as emptied a man whose entire self had been the machine watching the machine come apart. He looked at Abigail once as they loaded him, and she waited for the cleverness, the last reclassification, some final arithmetic. There wasn't any. "You really did keep the best books I ever saw," he said. It was not cruel. It was almost wondering. "If I'd been an honest man, Abigail, you'd have made me a rich one anyway. Honestly rich. I never could see why a man would settle for that." He shook his head. "I never could see it. That," Abigail said, "is the only true thing you ever told me, Silas. You couldn't see it. That was always the whole of you." And she turned and walked away, and did not watch the wagon go, because she had spent 2 years watching him, and she was done. Asa Quint's foot race began exactly as he'd promised. Within a week, a lawyer arrived from Las Vegas, representing one of the men who'd bought the paper, the smallest investor, the most frightened, offering full testimony against the others in exchange for his client's neck. Within 2, the man in Denver did the same. Quint had told them whoever talked first lived longest, and they had believed him, and they ran, and they trampled each other, reaching the prosecutor's door, and every one of them, exactly as Quint had warned, pointed at the bookkeeper. And every one of them broke on the same rock, because by the time the first lawyer pointed at Abigail Harper, the federal file already held Eldon Pace's 14 months of letters naming the entries she'd refused, and the day Mercer first threatened her. It held 400 sworn statements from a town that had watched her bleed on a post rather than sign. It held the backdated water claim, in Mercer's recording, not hers. And it held the testimony of a deputy U.S. Marshal who had ridden 3 months on the trail of a neat hand and found when he reached it, a woman chained to a post for the crime of trying to climb out of the very machine the rich men now swore she'd built. 6 rich men pointed at the bookkeeper. And the bookkeeper had been telling the truth in writing, in more than one hand, carried in more than one direction, for longer than any of them had known she was a threat. There was no outlawyering it. There was no reclassifying it. The truth had been copied too many times. Abigail Harper testified in the federal court in Santa Fe in the fall of 1883, and she did not hide a single thing. She told them about the early entries, the clean, willing, proud ones before she understood. She told them she had been good at it and had taken satisfaction in being good at it and had not asked the question she should have asked for the better part of a year because the work was steady and the pay was fair, and a careful woman in a town of 400 does not go looking for the reason her employer is rich. She put her own neatness on the record as the thing it was the work of a woman who had not yet let herself see. She did not ask for mercy. She asked only to be allowed to read the books out loud, all of them, every column, so that the court would have the truth complete and not in pieces. It took 2 days. Her voice gave out on the second one, and the judge recessed an hour and sent for tea and told her to take her time. And she finished, and when she set down the last ledger, the courtroom was silent. The judge looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "in 31 years on the bench, I have watched a great many people stand where you're standing and tell me only the parts that helped them. You are the first I can recall who walked in and read me the parts that did not. You have testified to your own willing hand in this fraud as plainly as you testified to your refusals. Why?" And Abigail Harper, who had stood on a post since dawn and bled rather than sign one more lie, lifted her chin and gave the federal court the truest answer she had. "Because a crooked ledger taught me everything wrong about my own life, Your Honor," she said. "It taught me that if you keep the columns neat enough, the neatness becomes its own kind of truth, and you never have to look at what the numbers mean. I kept beautiful books for a thief and told myself the beauty made them honest. It doesn't. Neatness isn't honesty. I had those confused for a long time, and a man named Eldon Pace and a man named Jack Callahan and a town full of people who finally stopped looking away taught me the difference." She looked at the open ledger. "An honest book isn't a neat one. It's a complete one. So I gave you the complete one, including the parts that hang me alongside him if that's where the arithmetic comes out. I'm done keeping books that leave things off the page." The judge did not hang her. He did not in the end jail her either, though he could have, and she had walked into the courtroom prepared for it. He found that the weight of 14 months of letters, 400 statements, a backdated claim in another man's hand, and a confession freely given complete, including the parts against herself, described not an architect of fraud, but a witness to it who had paid for her late courage with her own torn hands in a public square. He bound her over as the federal government's chief witness, restored to her the 40 acres of river-bottom land along the Pecos that had started all of it and entered into the permanent record of the United States. A finding that Abigail Harper had, at risk of her life, preserved the only honest account of 9 stolen farms. Silas Mercer was sentenced to 11 years in the federal penitentiary, one for each of the lies the court could prove with a date instead of a witness. Sheriff Mason Pruitt was not charged. The marshal said, "A man who drops his own star in the dirt in front of the town that paid for it has already sentenced himself harder than a court could." And Mason Pruitt went home to his Ruth and could look at her again, which he told Abigail later was the only verdict he'd ever cared about. Roy Dalton served 4 months for the things he'd done before the morning he stopped doing them and walked out of it and asked Abigail of all people to teach him his letters, so that no man would ever again make him sign a mark he couldn't read. She taught him. He learned. The first full sentence Roy Dalton ever read aloud unassisted was an entry in his own debt ledger, and he read it, and he laughed because he finally understood the number, and understanding it, he could finally fight it. Eldon Pace's ribs healed. He did not go back to stamping paper. The town of Red Hollow in the first vote it had taken about anything in 20 years that Silas Mercer had not already decided, elected him to keep the public records honest ones now, and he kept them in a neat hand that everyone in town had learned at last to read as the truth it was. And Jack Callahan stayed. That was the thing no one in Red Hollow had expected, least of all Abigail. A drifter, a legend, a man who told her he got tired of riding on towns, like Red Hollow, assumed men like that rode off the moment the work was done, because that was how the story always went, and a story they could not control frightened them less than a man who stayed. But the work in Red Hollow had never been the work Jack Callahan was running from, and Abigail had understood that the moment he told her about Cheyenne, about the girl, about the 1 minute too slow. He had not been riding away from anything for 15 years. He had been riding toward the post he could get to in time. And he had gotten to it. And a man who has finally done the thing he spent 15 years preparing to do does not have anywhere left he needs to ride. He turned in his star within the year, not in shame like Pruitt, but the way a man sets down a tool when the job it was for is finished, and he bought the strip of land that bordered the 40 acres of river bottom along the Pecos, and he fenced it slow and careful, the way Thomas Harper had once fenced his. It was Abigail who said the thing out loud in the end. It would have to be. She had learned that much about him, that he would stand between a woman and 11 guns without a word. But he would never be the one to ask for something he wanted, because men who have been 1 minute too slow do not believe they have the right. "You're a fool, Jack Callahan," she told him one evening at the rail fence between their two pieces of land. "If you think I'm going to keep walking down to this fence every sundown for the rest of my life to do my own asking." He looked at her in the long gold light. "I reckoned a woman who reads arithmetic that well," he said slowly, "would have worked out the sum a while back." "I worked it out the morning you cut me loose," Abigail said. "I just wanted to see if you'd ever get there yourself, or if I'd have to carry that column too, same as I carry every other one." But she was smiling when she said it, and so for the first time she had ever seen was he a real one. Not the memory of where one used to live, a true and unpracticed and slightly astonished smile on the weathered face of the legendary gunslinger who had ridden into Red Hollow, looking like nothing at all. They were married in the spring by the same federal judge who had heard her testimony, who said he had married exactly one couple in 31 years on the bench and had no intention of starting a habit, but that he'd be damned if he'd let anyone else do it. Abigail Harper kept her books for the rest of her long life. She kept them for honest men and honest women for the town of Red Hollow and the farms along the Pecos. And she kept them neat because she had always been good at it, but she never again confused the neatness with the truth. And on the first page of every new ledger she opened before a single entry, she wrote one word, the same word, in her own steady hand. Not remember. She had thought in the dark after the post that remembering was enough, that survival and a long memory of every face that walked past her was the most a woman in her position could hope to keep. She had been wrong about that, the way she'd been wrong about whether anyone would come. Remembering was where she'd started. It was not where the arithmetic came out. The word she wrote was witness, because she had learned on a post in a square in front of 400 people who finally stopped looking away, the one truth that no crooked ledger could ever reclassify, and no rich man's lawyer could ever out-argue, that the darkness in Red Hollow had never been Silas Mercer or the Post, or even the law that let him build his machine. The darkness had been 400 people agreeing not to see and calling that agreement peace. And the thing that broke it had not been a gun or a star or even the truth. It had been the moment one by one that people decided to stop looking away and become witnesses to each other. A thief steals what you have, but a witness keeps what is true. And in the end, in Red Hollow, in the fall of 1883, the witnesses outnumbered the thieves 400 to 1, and they always had, and they always would, the moment they remembered they were not alone. That was the whole of it. That was the only arithmetic that ever mattered. And Abigail Harper, who had bled on a post rather than sign one more lie, spent the rest of her days making certain that every book she ever kept came out at last on the side of the truth.